Today, we're going to talk about a name you definitely know, but a story you might not. Christopher Columbus. He's one of history's most famous and, let's be honest, most controversial figures. His ambition and his mistakes literally redrew the map of the world.
All right, so here's the headline we all learned in school. Columbus sails to find a new route to Asia and accidentally bumped into the Americas. Simple, right? Well, not so much. The real story is a wild ride of incredible ambition, a huge mathematical screw-up, and yeah, some pretty brutal consequences. So, let's get into what actually happened. So to really understand the man, we've got to go all the way back to Genoa, in what's now Italy, where he was born in 1451. His dad was a weaver, but during the summers he'd get out on the water. And from his very first voyage, Columbus was just completely hooked on the sea. But here's the thing, Columbus wasn't just your average sailor. For his time, he was incredibly well educated. He dove into mathematics, he studied map making, he learned how to read the stars. And this is absolutely crucial, he taught himself to speak Spanish, Portuguese, and Latin. This combo of street smarts on the sea and book smarts on land made him the kind of guy who could navigate not just oceans, but also the powerful royal courts of Europe. And then, when he's 25, something straight out of a movie happens. He's on a commercial trip, and his ship gets attacked and sunk by the Portuguese. Most of the crew dies. But Columbus, he grabs onto a piece of the wreckage and swims an unbelievable 10 kilometers to the shore. He lands in Portugal, and because he can speak the language, he's not just some shipwrecked sailor. He's a man with a fresh start in a new country. And what a country to land in. Lisbon at that time was basically the center of the universe for navigation and exploration. It was like Silicon Valley for sailors. So he's there, surrounded by all the latest maps, all the craziest new theories, and he starts thinking about Marco Polo's travels. And that's when he cooks up this absolutely radical idea. What if you could get to the spices and riches of the East by sailing west? Okay, but there was one tiny problem. His whole plan was built on a gigantic miscalculation. Columbus thought the Earth was way, way smaller than it actually is. He figured the trip to Asia would be about 5,000 kilometers. The real distance? Almost 20,000 kilometers. Let's be real clear. If the Americas hadn't been sitting right there in the middle of the ocean, he and his crew would have just disappeared. They would have starved to death, completely lost at sea.
So, trying to get money for this trip was a journey in itself. First, he goes to the King of Portugal. The king's experts take one look at his math and basically laugh him out of the room. So Columbus packs his bags and moves to Spain, where he spends the next 7 years trying to convince the Spanish court. Now you might be asking, why did they finally say yes? Well, the land routes to Asia were controlled by their rivals, making everything super expensive. Spain was hungry for a shortcut. Just when Columbus was about to give up and move to France, Queen Isabella changed her mind and said yes. His persistence, you gotta admit, was incredible.
So, in August 1492, Columbus sails out of Spain with 90 men and 3 little ships you've probably heard of, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. I mean, just picture it. They are sailing straight into the unknown, chasing a theory that pretty much every expert on the planet thought was dead wrong. 3 weeks at sea turned into 4, then 5. There was nothing but open ocean. The crew started to lose it. They were terrified, convinced they were sailing off the edge of the world to their deaths. It got so bad they were about to mutiny. So Columbus makes this high-stakes gamble. Give him 2 more days, just 2, and if they don't see land, he promises they'll turn around and go home. And literally, just as the clock was about to run out, a lookout screams, "Land!" On October 12th, 1492, they land on an island in what we now call the Bahamas. Columbus was so sure he'd made it to the East Indies, he called the native Taino people Indians. And that's a mistake, a massive geographical blunder that has stuck around for more than 500 years. And right here, in this moment, everything changes. Columbus spots the little bits of gold jewelry the native people are wearing. And just like that, this isn't a mission of exploration anymore. It becomes a gold rush. Before he even sails back to Spain, he leaves 39 of his men behind on an island with one simple, very clear order: get all the gold you can find. Back in Spain, the news of gold sends shockwaves through the royal court. For Columbus's second voyage, the goal wasn't discovery at all. It was exploitation. This wasn't an expedition, it was an invasion force. And just look at the difference in scale. He didn't get 3 little ships this time. Nope. The crown gave him a whole fleet. 17 ships packed and ready for colonization.
And he wasn't leading 90 nervous sailors. This time, he was in command of 1,200 men. We're talking soldiers, settlers, bureaucrats, all sent to set up a permanent base and start extracting wealth. And the first resource they decided to extract was people. On this second voyage, Columbus and his men captured about 1,500 Taino men, women, and children. The survivors were shipped to Spain and sold in the slave markets. This was the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade.
For the indigenous people of the Caribbean, this was an absolute apocalypse. The colonists used their steel weapons and armor to just overwhelm the local populations. It was a wave of murder, theft, and enslavement on a scale that's hard to even imagine. This was the start of a total demographic collapse. You know, Columbus's time as governor of these new colonies didn't last long. He was so brutal and so bad at managing things that reports of his tyranny made it all the way back to Spain. It got so bad, even the Spanish monarchy couldn't ignore it anymore.
So get this, in the year 1500, he was actually arrested, put in chains, and shipped back to Spain as a prisoner. A total public humiliation. But he was still useful to the king. So he was eventually pardoned and even given money for one last voyage. He came back to Spain for good in 1504, really sick, and died 2 years later. But because of that deal he'd made years before for 10% of all the profits, he died a very, very wealthy man.
And here's maybe the biggest irony of his entire life. After 4 voyages, after changing the world forever, Christopher Columbus died completely convinced that he had just found a new backdoor route to Asia. He never, ever understood that he'd stumbled upon 2 entire continents. He never grasped the true meaning of his own discovery. So how do we even begin to wrap our heads around a legacy like this? On one hand, he was a brilliant, unbelievably persistent navigator whose actions connected 2 worlds. That kicked off centuries of trade, migration, and exchange. But on the other hand, that connection came at a horrific, unimaginable cost for millions of people. And that leaves us with a really tough question to think about. Columbus's persistence changed human history. There's no arguing that. But it also kicked off a legacy of conquest, slavery, and death. It really makes you wonder, where is the line between the relentless drive for discovery and a justification for destruction?